Zara Williams, an 8-year-old girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile, stepped onto the yellow school bus for the first time in her new neighborhood. Her mother, Amara, waved goodbye, her heart brimming with hopes of a brighter future for their family. Yet, as the bus doors closed, neither of them could have foreseen the dark and chilling journey that awaited Zara. Mr. Harrison, the elderly bus driver with his gray hair and grandfatherly demeanor, seemed like the picture of trustworthiness. His warm smile, however, masked a sinister secret, a truth that would soon cast a heavy shadow over Zara's young life, in ways her parents could never have predicted. As weeks passed, Amara's maternal instincts began to scream that something was terribly wrong. Living in a predominantly white neighborhood, her mounting suspicions about Mr. Harrison, a long-standing and well-respected figure in the community, felt impossible to voice without fear of being dismissed or, worse, ridiculed. What unthinkable events were unfolding on that school bus? And how would one mother's unwavering determination to protect her child spark the exposure of a community's darkest, hidden truths? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the moving truck as 8-year-old Zara Williams pressed her face against the car window, her dark eyes wide with wonder. The houses in this new neighborhood seemed to stretch toward the sky, each one grander than the last, with perfectly manicured lawns and gleaming windows that winked in the early light. "Is that really our house, Mommy?" Zara whispered, pointing to a beautiful colonial-style home with white columns and a wraparound porch. Her breath fogged up the glass, creating a small cloud that she quickly wiped away, not wanting to miss a single detail. Amara Williams glanced in the rearview mirror, catching her daughter's awestruck expression. "That's right, baby. That's our new home." She shared a proud look with her husband, Marcus, who sat in the passenger seat, reviewing work documents on his tablet. "It's like a castle," Zara exclaimed, bouncing in her seat. Her collection of rainbow-colored braids, carefully done by Amara the night before, danced with her movement. As they pulled into the driveway, Zara couldn't unbuckle her seatbelt fast enough. She burst from the car like a butterfly from its chrysalis, her pink backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she raced up the front path. The morning dew had left tiny diamonds on the grass, and the air smelled of freshly cut lawn and possibility. Marcus finally looked up from his tablet, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Careful, princess. Let's wait for the movers before we go exploring." His voice carried the warm authority that always made Zara feel safe, even in new situations. As if on cue, the moving truck rumbled to a stop behind their car. Neighbors began to appear on their porches or pause their morning jogs, watching with poorly concealed curiosity. Amara noticed that they were the only black family on the street, but she'd expected that. This prestigious suburb was known for its excellent schools and low crime rates. Exactly what they wanted for Zara, even if its diversity left something to be desired. "Good morning," a voice called out. An elderly white woman in a floral dress approached, carrying what appeared to be a welcome basket. "I'm Mrs. Parker from next door. We're so pleased to have new neighbors." There was something slightly off in her tone, a hint of something that made Amara's smile freeze for just a moment, but she pushed the thought aside. "Thank you. I'm Amara Williams, and this is my husband Marcus. And that little whirlwind over there is our daughter Zara." Mrs. Parker's eyes flickered between them, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "Oh, how nice. And what do you do, Mr. Williams?" "I'm a corporate lawyer with Hamilton and Associates downtown," Marcus replied smoothly, used to these kinds of interactions. "And my wife is a graphic designer." "Oh." Mrs. Parker's eyebrows shot up. "How impressive." She thrust the welcome basket into Amara's hands and retreated quickly, muttering something about letting them get settled. Meanwhile, Zara had discovered the tire swing hanging from a massive oak tree in their backyard. Her delighted squeals filled the air as she spun in circles, her braids flying out like streamers in the wind. "Daddy, look. Can we keep it?" Marcus's face softened as he watched his daughter play. "Of course, princess. This is your home now." As the movers began unloading furniture, Amara stood in the doorway of their new house, taking it all in. The foyer opened into a spacious living room with a grand fireplace. Sunlight streamed through large windows, creating patterns on the hardwood floors. This was what they'd worked so hard for, a better life for Zara, a safer community, the best education possible. Later that evening, after pizza on paper plates, because the kitchen boxes hadn't been unpacked yet, Zara sat on her new window seat, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. Her room was still a maze of boxes, but she'd already decided it was perfect. "Ready for bed, sweetheart?" Amara asked, appearing in the doorway with Zara's favorite stuffed elephant. "Big day tomorrow. First day at your new school." Zara hugged her elephant close. "Do you think they'll like me, Mommy?" Amara sat beside her daughter, pulling her close. "Of course they will, baby. You're smart, kind, and beautiful. Just be yourself." "But," Zara hesitated, her small fingers playing with one of her braids, "I noticed that none of the kids I saw today looked like me." Amara's heart tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "That doesn't matter, Zara. What matters is who you are on the inside. Remember what Daddy always says? Our differences make us special," Zara recited, smiling. "That's right." Amara kissed her daughter's forehead. "Now, time for sleep. Tomorrow is a new adventure." As Zara drifted off to sleep, Amara joined Marcus in their new master bedroom. He was already in bed, still working on his laptop. "She's worried about fitting in," Amara said softly. Marcus looked up. "She'll be fine. This is one of the best school districts in the state. That's why we moved here, remember?" Amara nodded, but couldn't shake the memory of Mrs. Parker's tight smile, the watching neighbors, the subtle undercurrent she'd felt all day. Still, this was their dream, their chance to give Zara everything they'd worked for. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, its shadows dancing across Zara's window like silent guardians of the night. The yellow school bus gleamed in the morning light as it approached the Williams house. Zara stood at the end of their driveway, her new butterfly backpack perfectly positioned on her shoulders, and her favorite blue ribbon tied neatly around one of her braids. Amara knelt beside her, adjusting her collar one last time. "Remember, baby, you're going to do great," Amara whispered, trying to hide her own nervousness behind a bright smile. The bus squealed to a stop, its doors opening with a mechanical hiss. Zara's steps faltered as she approached the entrance. The bus driver, Mr. Harrison, a heavy-set man with graying temples and deep-set eyes, glanced down at his roster, then at Zara, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. "Name?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Zara Williams," she replied softly, her small fingers clutching the straps of her backpack. Mr. Harrison made a show of checking his list again, taking longer than necessary. "Williams? Williams? Ah, yes. Find a seat." His tone carried none of the warmth Zara had heard him use with the children at the previous stop. As Zara climbed the steps, she noticed most of the seats were occupied by pairs of students, their backpacks strategically placed in empty spaces. She walked down the aisle, her heart beating faster with each step. Finally, near the back, she found an empty seat. "Excuse me," she said politely to a girl with blonde pigtails. "Can you sit here?" The girl looked up, then quickly turned to the window. "I'm saving it for my friend at the next stop." This scene repeated itself 2 more times before Zara finally found a seat at the very back of the bus. Through the window, she could see her mother still standing in the driveway, waving. Zara waved back, forcing a smile she didn't feel. At school, Mrs. Thompson's 3rd-grade classroom was bright and colorful, with motivational posters covering the walls. When Zara entered, the teacher's welcome seemed genuine enough. "Class, we have a new student joining us today," Mrs. Thompson announced. "This is Zara Williams. Let's make her feel welcome." The students mumbled a half-hearted hello, their eyes studying her with undisguised curiosity. Zara noticed some of them whispering behind their hands, stealing glances at her hair. During morning break, Zara sat alone on a bench, watching other children play. A group of girls nearby were playing jump rope, their laughter carrying across the playground. One girl, Emma, noticed Zara and seemed about to wave her over, but another girl quickly whispered something, and they all turned away. At lunch, Zara unpacked the special meal Amara had prepared, her favorite jollof rice with plantains. As she opened the container, a boy at her table wrinkled his nose. "What's that weird food?" he asked loudly. "It smells funny." Heat rushed to Zara's cheeks as several heads turned her way. She quietly closed the container and pulled out her apple instead, her appetite gone. The afternoon dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. When the final bell rang, Zara was the first one out of her seat. But as she boarded the bus home, Mr. Harrison's voice stopped her. "Hold on there," he said, his eyes narrow. "Show me your bus pass again." Zara fumbled in her backpack, aware of the line of students forming behind her. She could hear their impatient sighs, their muttered complaints. "But you saw it this morning," she said quietly. "Rules are rules," Mr. Harrison insisted, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "No pass, no ride." Just as Zara's eyes began to fill with tears, Mrs. Thompson walked by and intervened. "Mr. Harrison, I can verify that Zara is assigned to this bus. I have her paperwork right here." The ride home was silent, with Zara trying to make herself as small as possible in her back seat. When she finally walked through her front door, Amara immediately noticed something was different. The usual bounce in Zara's step was gone, her shoulders slightly slumped. "How was your first day, sweetheart?" Amara asked, setting down her design tablet. "Fine," Zara replied, her voice flat. She headed straight to her room, leaving her backpack by the stairs, something she never did. Later that evening, as Amara helped Zara prepare for bed, she noticed her daughter's lunch container was still full. "Weren't you hungry today, baby?" Zara shrugged, avoiding her mother's eyes. "I just had my apple. I wasn't very hungry." Amara sat on the edge of Zara's bed, gently stroking her daughter's hair. "Did something happen at school today that you want to talk about?" For a moment, it seemed like Zara might say something. Her lower lip trembled slightly, but then she shook her head. "No, Mommy, I'm just tired." That night, after Zara had fallen asleep, Amara stood in the doorway of her daughter's room, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. But what could she say to Marcus? That their daughter seemed slightly less happy? That the bus driver had checked her pass twice? That no one had sat with her at lunch? Each incident seemed so small on its own, like tiny paper cuts. But Amara knew from experience that paper cuts could still make you bleed. Outside, the moon cast long shadows through Zara's window, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at unseen threats in the darkness. 3 weeks had passed since Zara's first day at her new school, and the changes in her were becoming impossible to ignore. The little girl who once filled their home with endless chatter and spontaneous dance performances now moved through rooms like a silent shadow. One morning, as Amara braided Zara's hair for school, she noticed her daughter wincing more than usual. "Does it hurt, baby?" Amara asked, gentling her touch. "No," Zara mumbled, but then added quietly, "Could you maybe make them different today?" "Different how?" "Like..." Zara hesitated, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. "Maybe straight? Like Emma's hair?" Amara's hand stilled. "Baby, your hair is beautiful just the way it is. Those braids are part of who you are, part of our culture. But nobody else at school has hair like mine," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible. "They keep asking to touch it. And yesterday, Jason said it looks like rope." The hairbrush trembled slightly in Amara's hand as she fought to keep her voice steady. "Did you tell your teacher?" Zara shook her head quickly. "I don't want to make trouble. Can I just stay home today? My stomach hurts." It was the third time this week Zara had complained of stomach aches before school. Amara pressed her lips together, noting how her daughter's shoulders tensed as the distant rumble of the approaching school bus grew louder. That evening, after Zara had gone to bed, Amara found Marcus in his home office, surrounded by legal briefs. "We need to talk about Zara," she said, closing the door behind her. Marcus glanced up briefly. "Can it wait? I have a big case tomorrow." "No, it can't wait." Amara's voice was firm. "Something's wrong. She's not eating properly. She's making excuses not to go to school, And today she asked me to change her hair because kids are making fun of it. Marcus sighed, removing his glasses. Kids can be mean sometimes, Amara. It's just part of growing up. This is different, Amara insisted. She's withdrawing into herself. Yesterday, I found her favorite dress stuffed in the trash because it's too colorful. She doesn't sing anymore, doesn't dance. Our baby is disappearing right in front of us. You're being dramatic, Marcus replied, his tone dismissive. She's adjusting to a new environment. Change takes time. We knew there might be some challenges when we moved here. Challenges? Amara's voice rose slightly. Marcus, this morning she asked me why her skin isn't lighter like her classmates. She's 8 years old. Lower your voice, Marcus warned, glancing towards Zara's room. Look, I went through similar things when I was the only black kid in my prep school. It made me stronger. Zara needs to learn to handle these situations. Handle these situations? Amara repeated incredulously. She's a child. And what about that bus driver? Every time I watch her get on that bus, he looks at her like she doesn't belong there. Marcus leaned back in his chair, frustration evident in his expression. Do you have any actual evidence of misconduct, or are you just seeing what you expect to see? The words hit Amara like a physical blow. So now I'm imagining things? Just being paranoid? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Amara cut him off. Because from where I'm standing, you're so focused on fitting into this neighborhood that you can't see what it's doing to our daughter. What it's doing? Marcus stood up, his voice sharp. What it's doing is giving her opportunities we never had. The best education, a safe neighborhood, a chance at a better future. Isn't that why we moved here? Not at the cost of her spirit. Amara shot back. Not at the cost of her identity. Their argument was interrupted by a small sound at the door. They turned to find Zara standing there in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed elephant, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'll try harder to fit in. Please don't fight because of me. Amara rushed to embrace her daughter, but Zara pulled away, running back to her room. The sound of her door closing echoed through the suddenly silent house. Marcus slumped back in his chair, the fight draining from him. Maybe you're right, he admitted quietly. Maybe I've been too focused on making this work. Amara wiped away her own tears. I know you want what's best for her. So do I. But Marcus, we can't keep dismissing these signs. Something is happening to our baby girl, and if we don't act now... She left the sentence unfinished, but the weight of unspoken fears filled the room. Through the window, they could see the bus stop where Zara would wait tomorrow morning, illuminated by a single street lamp that cast long, dark shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. In her room, Zara lay awake, holding her elephant tight against her chest. She could hear her parents' muffled voices through the wall, still discussing in quieter tones. She closed her eyes and tried to remember how it felt to dance without worry, to laugh without checking if anyone was watching, to simply be herself without feeling like that self was somehow wrong. The moon cast patterns through her window, and in the darkness, Zara made a decision. Tomorrow, she would try harder to be what everyone wanted her to be. Maybe then, the shadows would finally leave her alone. The next morning, after watching Zara board the school bus, Amara didn't turn back toward the house as usual. Instead, she slipped into her car, waiting until the bus pulled away before following at a discreet distance. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her wedding ring clicking against the leather as she made each turn. Through her windshield, she watched as the bus made its scheduled stops. At each one, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. White children were greeted with a smile and friendly nod from Mr. Harrison. But when the Johnson twins, the only other black children on the route, boarded the bus, he made them wait while checking their passes, just as he did with Zara. Amara pulled over and grabbed her phone, quickly typing notes into a document she'd created the night before. Day 1. Bus driver shows clear pattern of discrimination. Checks passes only for children of color. As she finished typing, a sharp knock on her car window made her jump. Mrs. Parker stood there, her usual floral dress replaced by an expensive jogging outfit, her face pinched with suspicion. Mrs. Williams, she said as Amara rolled down the window. I couldn't help but notice you following the school bus. Is everything all right? The false concern in her neighbor's voice made Amara's skin crawl, but she maintained her composure. Just making sure my daughter gets to school safely, Mrs. Parker. Is there a problem with that? Well, Mrs. Parker leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Several neighbors have expressed concern about a suspicious vehicle following the school bus. We take our children's safety very seriously in this neighborhood. Amara's smile was razor-sharp. How interesting that my car becomes suspicious when I'm concerned about my child's safety, but none of you seemed worried when Mrs. Thompson followed the bus last week to deliver forgotten permission slips. Mrs. Parker's face flushed. That was different. Different how exactly? Amara challenged, maintaining direct eye contact. Mrs. Parker straightened up, her friendly facade cracking. Listen here, Mrs. Williams. We've managed to keep this neighborhood safe and peaceful for decades. We don't need your kind coming in and stirring up trouble. My kind, Amara repeated, her voice deadly quiet. She reached for her phone and hit record. Would you care to elaborate on what you mean by that, Mrs. Parker? The older woman's eyes widened at the sight of the phone. She backed away quickly, muttering something about being late for her morning walk. Amara watched her hurry away, then added another note to her document. Confrontation with Mrs. Parker. Direct racial prejudice expressed. Recording saved. Over the next few hours, Amara drove around the neighborhood, observing and documenting. She noticed how the security patrol car slowed down significantly when passing their house. How the crossing guard chatted warmly with every parent except the handful of people of color. How the local coffee shop staff served customers in a subtly different order than their arrival. At the grocery store, she overheard two women discussing the upcoming neighborhood association meeting. Did you hear they're trying to change the community guidelines? One whispered. Those new families want to allow more diverse architectural styles. Next thing you know, our property values will plummet. Amara added it to her growing list of documentation. That afternoon, she arrived at the school early, parking where she could observe the bus loading area. She watched as Zara emerged from the building with her class. A group of girls walked ahead of her, occasionally looking back and giggling. Zara kept her head down, clutching her backpack straps. As the children lined up for their buses, Amara noticed Mr. Harrison checking passes again, but only for certain students. She recorded everything on her phone, her hands shaking with barely contained anger. Back home, Amara created a detailed spreadsheet on her computer. She categorized each incident: transportation discrimination, neighbor harassment, community exclusion, microaggressions. She added dates, times, and witnesses where possible. Then she started a new folder labeled Evidence and transferred all her recordings and photos. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Working late tonight. Big case tomorrow. Amara stared at the message, then added it to a separate list she'd started. Days Marcus worked late since moving. 15 out of 21 workdays. From upstairs came the sound of Zara's violin practice. Or rather, the lack of it. Where once beautiful music had filled their home, now only hesitant, uncertain notes emerged. Yesterday, Zara had asked to quit her lessons, saying she didn't want to stand out anymore. Amara's printer hummed as she printed copies of her documentation. She carefully organized everything into a binder, including Mrs. Parker's recorded comments, photos of the security car lingering outside their house, and detailed notes about Mr. Harrison's discriminatory behavior. As she worked, she could hear Mrs. Parker's voice through the open window, talking to another neighbor. I just don't understand why they can't be more like the Chens down the street. They're minorities too, but they know how to fit in. Amara added that comment to her documentation, then sat back, looking at the growing evidence of systematic discrimination. Her phone buzzed again, an email from the school announcing the next PTA meeting. The agenda included a discussion about maintaining community standards. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd saved earlier that day. Hello, this is the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education. How may I help you? Amara took a deep breath, her voice steady and determined. Yes, I'd like to report multiple incidents of discrimination at Riverside Elementary School and its transportation services. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across her desk, but for the first time since moving here, Amara felt like she was finally stepping into the light. The rain fell in heavy sheets that Thursday afternoon, turning the world into a gray blur. Amara sat at her desk, trying to focus on her design work when her phone rang. The school's number flashed on the screen. "Mrs. Williams?" The secretary's voice was tense. "There's been an incident. Your daughter Zara." Amara was already grabbing her keys. "What happened?" "Mr. Harrison says Zara missed the bus, but, well, you should come quickly." Amara's heart pounded as she drove through the downpour. When she arrived at the school, she found Zara huddled in the nurse's office, soaking wet and shivering, her braids dripping onto the paper sheet covering the examination table. "Baby, what happened?" Amara rushed to her daughter, wrapping her in a tight embrace. But Zara just buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. The principal, Dr. Stevens, appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Williams, if I could speak with you privately?" "I'm not leaving my daughter," Amara said firmly, still holding Zara. "Very well." Dr. Stevens cleared his throat. "According to Mr. Harrison, Zara wasn't at the bus stop when he arrived. But several students have come forward saying she was there, and he drove away anyway." Amara felt Zara stiffen in her arms. "He saw me, Mommy," Zara whispered, her voice breaking. "I was waving and running, but he looked right at me and closed the door. Then he drove away, and I was all alone in the rain." The rage that filled Amara was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. "How long was she out there?" "Almost 2 hours," Dr. Stevens admitted. A teacher finally spotted her walking along Madison Avenue, 3 miles from the school. Zara's grip on her mother tightened. "I tried to call you, but my phone got wet and stopped working. I was so scared, Mommy. Cars kept splashing me, and nobody would stop to help." "Why didn't you go back to the school?" Amara asked gently. "Because," Zara's voice dropped to a whisper, "because Mr. Harrison said if I caused any trouble, he'd make sure all the other kids knew I was a snitch. He said nobody likes a snitch, especially a—" She stopped, unable to repeat the word. "Especially a what, baby?" Amara's voice was deadly quiet. But before Zara could answer, Marcus burst into the room, still in his court suit. "What's going on?" "I got your messages." He stopped short at the sight of his drenched daughter. And suddenly, like a dam breaking, everything poured out of Zara. "He's been so mean, Daddy," she sobbed. "He makes me sit in the back even when there are empty seats up front. He tells the other kids not to sit with me. He checks my pass every day and says things like making sure you belong here. And when I tried to tell Mrs. Thompson, he followed me after school and said people like me should know their place." Marcus's face darkened with each word. "Why didn't you tell us sooner, princess?" "Because," Zara hiccuped through her tears, "because I heard you fighting about me. I didn't want to make more trouble. I thought if I just tried harder to fit in." Her voice broke again. "But nothing works. The kids at lunch say their parents don't want them playing with me. Emma's mom won't let her come to my birthday party. And Mrs. Parker tells everyone to watch their things when I walk by." Amara and Marcus exchanged devastated looks over their daughter's head. All the signs had been there. The lost appetite, the quiet withdrawal, the sudden dislike of her favorite things. They'd seen the shadows growing, but hadn't realized just how dark they'd become. "Dr. Stevens," Marcus's voice was ice cold, "I want Mr. Harrison fired. Today." "Mr. Williams, there are procedures." "I don't care about procedures." Marcus exploded, making everyone jump. "My 8-year-old daughter was abandoned in a rainstorm and forced to walk 3 miles alone because of that man's racism. You'll have a lawsuit on your desk tomorrow morning if he's still employed." Zara grabbed her father's hand. "Please don't be mad, Daddy. I tried to be strong like you said." Marcus knelt beside his daughter, tears in his eyes. "No, princess. I was wrong. You shouldn't have to be strong like that. Not ever." Amara pulled out her binder of documentation. "Dr. Stevens, I've been recording everything. The discrimination, the harassment, all of it. You can handle this internally, or we can take it to the media. Your choice." The principal paled as he flipped through the evidence. "I'll call an emergency board meeting immediately." That evening, The Williams family huddled together on Zara's bed, her wet clothes replaced with warm pajamas, her hair carefully reb-braided by Amara. The storm continued outside, but inside, something had shifted. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner," Marcus said softly to his wife. "I was so focused on giving Zara opportunities that I forgot to protect her heart." Amara squeezed his hand. "We're going to fix this. All of it." Zara looked up at her parents, her eyes still red from crying, but clearer now. "Are we going to move again?" "No, baby," Amara said firmly. "We're going to stay right here and fight. Because you belong here just as much as anyone else." Thunder rolled outside, but Zara didn't flinch. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe, wrapped in her parents' love and understanding. The shadows that had been growing around her began to recede, replaced by something stronger, the light of truth finally breaking through the darkness. The police station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Detective Miller's face as he reviewed the Williams complaint. His expression remained carefully neutral, but his body language spoke volumes as he slowly closed Amara's evidence binder. "Mrs. Williams," he began, leaning back in his chair, "while I understand your concerns, what you're describing sounds more like misunderstandings rather than criminal behavior." Marcus, still in his court suit, leaned forward. "Misunderstandings? My daughter was abandoned miles from home in a rainstorm. She could have been kidnapped, hit by a car." According to the bus driver's report, Detective Miller interrupted, shuffling through some papers. "Your daughter wasn't at her designated stop on time." "We have witnesses," Amara countered, pulling out her phone. 3 students provided video evidence showing Zara at the stop, showing Mr. Harrison looking directly at her before driving away. The detective's dismissive expression faltered slightly as he watched the video. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted in the station's lobby. "Is that the Williams family?" A woman's voice called out. "We're here to support their complaint." Through the office window, they could see Sarah Johnson, mother of the twins from Zara's bus route, leading a group of parents into the station. Behind her stood Mr. Chun, whose son had recently left the school, and several other families of color from their community. "Detective," Sarah announced, striding into the office, "we all have evidence of Mr. Harrison's discriminatory behavior. And it's not just him. This is about systematic discrimination throughout Riverside Elementary." One by one, the families presented their documentation. Mr. Chin described how his son had been repeatedly denied access to advanced math classes despite perfect test scores. The Rodriguezes shared recordings of their daughter being mocked for speaking Spanish. The Patels showed emails from the PTA excluding them from event planning committees. Detective Miller's demeanor shifted as the evidence mounted. This is more extensive than initially reported. And it gets worse," Sarah added, pulling out her phone. "After word got out about what happened to Zara, we created a private online group. More families are coming forward every hour." The station's chief of police appeared in the doorway, drawn by the growing crowd in his precinct. "Miller, what's going on here?" Before the detective could answer, Marcus stood up, his lawyer's training taking over. "What's going on, Chief Roberts, is that we're filing a formal complaint about civil rights violations at Riverside Elementary School. We have evidence of racial discrimination, harassment, and child endangerment." The news spread through the community like wildfire. By that evening, the local media had picked up the story. Cameras gathered outside the school, where 2 distinct groups had formed. On one side stood the families supporting the Williams, their numbers growing as more parents recognized similar patterns in their own children's experiences. On the other side, a group of residents, led by Mrs. Parker, defended what they called their traditional community values. "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Parker declared to a news reporter. "They're trying to destroy our school's reputation with these baseless accusations. Mr. Harrison is a respected member of our community who's driven that bus for 20 years. 20 years of discrimination is still discrimination," Amara responded calmly to the same reporter. "And we have the evidence to prove it." The school board called an emergency meeting that evening. The auditorium was packed, with tension thick in the air as parents from both sides faced each other across the aisle. Dr. Stevens attempted to maintain order as speakers took turns at the microphone. Some defended the status quo, speaking about maintaining standards and avoiding unnecessary changes. Others shared their own stories of discrimination, their voices growing stronger with each testimony. Then Zara stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent as the small girl, still wearing her blue ribbon, began to speak. "I used to love school," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I love learning and making friends. But here I learned different lessons. I learned to be quiet when people say mean things. I learned to eat lunch alone because nobody wants to sit with me. I learned to feel ashamed of my hair, my skin, and my lunch. But the worst lesson was when Mr. Harrison left me in the rain. I learned that some grown-ups think it's okay to hurt kids just because they look different." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Mrs. Parker looked away, unable to meet the direct gaze of the 8-year-old girl whose spirit they had tried so hard to break. As the meeting continued, clear battle lines emerged in the community. Some longtime residents announced they would withdraw their children from the school in protest. Others, including several white families, stepped forward to join the Williams cause, ashamed of their previous silence. Later that night, as Amara checked her phone, she found hundreds of messages from families across the district sharing similar stories. A hashtag had started trending. #JusticeForZara. "It's bigger than just us now," she told Marcus as they watched Zara sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. "This could change things for every child in the district." Marcus nodded, his expression determined. "Then we'll see it through, no matter what it takes." Outside their window, cars drove past slowly. Some supportive neighbors dropping off letters of encouragement, others taking photos of their house for less friendly reasons. The community's facade of unity had cracked, revealing the deep-seated prejudices beneath. But in that crack, something new was growing: hope, determination, and the first real possibility of change. The shadows that had haunted their daughter were finally being dragged into the light, where they could no longer hide behind polite smiles and carefully worded excuses. The battle was far from over, but they weren't fighting alone anymore. And sometimes that makes all the difference. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Marcus Williams, now representing not just his family, but 17 others, strode through the media gauntlet. Camera flashes illuminated the determination on his face as he carried a box laden with evidence files. "Mr. Williams," reporters called out, "is it true that the school district tried to settle out of court?" Marcus paused, adjusting his tie. "This was never about money," he stated firmly. "This is about systemic change. Our children deserve better than secret settlements and empty promises." Inside the courtroom, Mr. Harrison sat with his union representative and the school district's lawyers. He looked smaller somehow, his usual air of authority deflated under the fluorescent lights. When Zara entered with her mother, he couldn't meet their eyes. The proceedings began with opening statements. The district's lawyer spoke about Mr. Harrison's decades of dedicated service and suggested that recent events had been misinterpreted. But when Marcus stood to present their case, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. "Your Honor," he began, "this isn't just about one incident in the rain. This is about a pattern of discrimination so deeply embedded in our school system that it had become invisible to those in power. Today, we're making it visible." One by one, families took the stand. The Johnson twins described years of random bag searches. Mr. Chen presented data showing systematic exclusion of Asian students from leadership positions. Mrs. Rodriguez played recordings of her daughter being mocked for her accent by teachers who should have protected her. During a break in proceedings, Amara's phone buzzed with notifications. Their story had gone national. #JusticeForZara was trending nationwide, with similar stories pouring in from across the country. Major news networks were picking up the feed from local stations, broadcasting images of the diverse group of families united in their fight for change. "Mom," Zara whispered, tugging at Amara's sleeve. "Look at this." She held up her tablet, showing a video of students from schools across the state wearing blue ribbons, the same one she'd worn the day Mr. Harrison left her in the rain. It had become a symbol of solidarity. Back in the courtroom, Mr. Harrison finally took the stand. Under cross-examination by Marcus, his carefully constructed explanations began to crumble. "Can you explain," Marcus asked, displaying security footage on the courtroom screen, "why you checked bus passes only for students of color during the entire month of September?" Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "It was random selection." "Random?" Marcus interrupted, presenting a statistical analysis. "According to this data, a student of color was 27 times more likely to have their pass checked than a white student. What are the odds of that being random?" The testimony continued for days. Meanwhile, the school board was holding its own emergency sessions. Under intense public pressure, they announced the formation of a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. But when they tried to stack it with their usual allies, the community pushed back. "No more token gestures," Sarah Johnson declared at a packed board meeting. "We demand real representation and real power to make changes." The boardroom erupted in applause as parents of all backgrounds stood in support. Even some of Mrs. Parker's former allies were switching sides, unable to ignore the evidence any longer. Dr. Stevens, looking tired and chastened, announced his retirement. "It's clear that new leadership is needed," he admitted. "Leadership that better reflects our entire community." The diversity committee, when finally formed, was revolutionary in its composition. Parents from various racial and ethnic backgrounds, teachers committed to change, students old enough to articulate their experiences, and civil rights experts to guide the process. Amara, elected as committee chair, stood at their first meeting looking out at the determined faces before her. "This isn't just about punishing past wrongs," she declared. "This is about building a better future for all our children." The committee's first actions were bold: mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, curriculum reviews to ensure diverse perspectives, transparent disciplinary procedures, and a new transportation oversight system. Back in court, the judge's ruling was unequivocal. Mr. Harrison was terminated, and the district was placed under federal supervision for 3 years. But the most significant victory came in the form of mandatory policy changes that would affect every school in the district. As Marcus packed up his files after the verdict, a young white mother approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "My daughter came home yesterday and told me she finally learned about Ruby Bridges in class. She said she understands now why this fight matters." That evening, the Williams family sat in their living room, watching news coverage of the verdict. Zara, curled up between her parents, looked different now, stronger, more confident. The shadows that had haunted her were retreating. "Daddy," she asked, "did we really change things?" Marcus hugged her close. "We started the change, princess, but there's still work to do." Amara nodded, reviewing plans for the next diversity committee meeting on her laptop. "Change is like a garden, baby. First you have to clear the ground, then plant the seeds, then tend them carefully until they grow." Outside their window, they could see their neighbors gathering. Not in opposition this time, but for the community's first-ever multicultural festival, organized by the new committee. The sound of different languages and music filled the air, and children of all backgrounds played together on the community lawn. Zara's blue ribbon had started a movement, but more importantly, it had started conversations that couldn't be silenced anymore. In classrooms across the district, students were learning to speak up against injustice. In teacher lounges, difficult discussions about privilege and responsibility were taking place. In homes throughout the community, families were examining their own biases and choosing to do better. The battle for justice wasn't over, but the foundations for real change had been laid. And in the end, that's how transformation begins, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of courage that inspire others to stand up and speak out. The criminal courthouse was quieter than the civil proceedings had been. Mr. Harrison sat at the defendant's table, facing charges of child endangerment and civil rights violations. The security footage played on the courtroom screen, showing him deliberately closing the bus doors and driving away as Zara ran toward the bus in the rain. "The state will prove," the prosecutor announced, "that this was not a simple oversight, but a deliberate act motivated by racial bias, putting a child's life at risk." Zara, sitting between her parents in the gallery, gripped her mother's hand as she testified. Her voice was stronger now, no longer carrying the tremor of fear that had become so familiar. "I kept running after the bus," she told the court, calling out Mr. Harrison, wait. He looked right at me in his mirror. He saw me, and then he just drove away. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. Guilty on all counts. As the bailiff led Mr. Harrison away, he finally looked at Zara, his face a mixture of shame and resignation. But Zara didn't look away this time. She sat tall, her blue ribbon bright against her dark braids, knowing she had spoken her truth. Outside the courthouse, Marcus addressed the waiting media. Today's verdict sends a clear message. Our children's safety and dignity are not negotiable. But this case was never just about punishment. It's about transformation. That transformation was already visible throughout the community. The new school superintendent, Dr. Angela Chun, had implemented sweeping changes. Every bus now had cameras and GPS tracking. A new anonymous reporting system allowed students to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. The curriculum had been revamped to include diverse perspectives and histories. But perhaps the most significant changes were happening in the smaller moments. One morning, as Zara boarded her bus, the new driver, Ms. Rodriguez, greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Zara. I love your braids today." Zara beamed as she walked down the aisle, where Emma waved her over to an empty seat. "I got my mom to buy me that book you recommended," Emma said excitedly. "The one about the girl who uses her grandmother's Nigerian recipes to make magic." During lunch, the cafeteria now buzzed with conversations in multiple languages. Students traded snacks and stories, curious about each other's cultures rather than mocking them. Zara's jollof rice had become so popular that several classmates had asked their parents to learn how to make it. Mrs. Thompson's classroom walls now displayed artwork and projects celebrating different cultures. A heritage corner allowed students to share stories and traditions from their families. Zara had brought in photos of her grandmother's traditional Nigerian ceremonies, proudly explaining their significance to her classmates. Even Mrs. Parker had undergone a change. After attending mandatory community education sessions, she'd approached Amara at a PTA meeting. I owe you an apology," she'd said, her usual confidence replaced by genuine remorse. "I never thought about how my actions affected children like Zara. I want to do better." Now, Mrs. Parker was one of the most active members of the diversity committee, using her influence to challenge old prejudices and promote inclusion. Zara's healing process was ongoing, but the changes were evident. Her nightmares about the rainy day had decreased. She'd started playing her violin again, this time incorporating both classical pieces and African melodies. Her artwork, once muted and careful, now exploded with color and confidence. The school's new counselor, Dr. Jackson, worked with Zara and other students who'd experienced discrimination, helping them process their experiences and rebuild their self-esteem. Sometimes, Dr. Jackson told Zara during one session, "Being brave means telling your story even when it's hard. You help make things better not just for yourself, but for many other children." The Diversity Committee, under Amara's leadership, had become a model for other districts. They'd implemented a comprehensive safety plan that included regular cultural competency training for all staff, clear protocols for reporting and addressing discrimination, monthly community dialogue sessions, mentor programs pairing older students with younger ones, emergency response systems to ensure no child was ever left vulnerable again. One evening, as the Williams family walked home from a community festival, they passed the bus stop where everything had changed. Zara paused, looking at the spot where she'd once stood in the rain. "Are you okay, baby?" Amara asked softly. Zara nodded, reaching for both her parents' hands. "I was just thinking, that day was really scary, but look at everything that changed because of it. Like when you tell me that sometimes the hardest rain helps flowers grow." Marcus lifted her onto his shoulders, and Zara laughed, a free, unworried sound that echoed through the neighborhood. Other families walking home from the festival waved and called out greetings. Children wearing blue ribbons rode their bikes past, their different languages and laughter mixing in the evening air. At home, Zara went straight to her room, not to hide anymore, but to practice a new piece she was preparing for the school's multicultural talent show. The music floated through the house, strong and confident, mixing classical techniques with rhythms from her heritage. Amara and Marcus stood in the doorway, watching their daughter play. The shadows that had once threatened to dim her light were gone, replaced by the glow of a child who knew her worth and her place in the world. "She's going to be okay," Amara whispered, leaning against her husband. Marcus nodded, listening to their daughter's music fill their home with hope. "Better than okay. She's going to be extraordinary." Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, and the old oak tree cast different shadows now, not threatening ones, but the kind that dance and play in the light of transformation and change. 1 year after the trial, Riverside Elementary School looked markedly different. The once uniform hallways now burst with color, displaying student artwork celebrating diverse cultures and histories. Above the main entrance, a new mural proclaimed in multiple languages, "All belong here." Zara stood before her classmates during morning assembly, no longer the scared little girl who'd once hidden in the shadows. As student council president, the first student of color elected to the position, she addressed the gathered crowd with confidence. "Last year, we learned that change isn't just about rules and policies," she said, her blue ribbon now accompanied by a leadership pin. "It's about opening our hearts and minds to understand each other better." The assembly celebrated the first anniversary of the school's transformation. Dr. Angela Chun, the new superintendent, presented data showing remarkable improvements. Disciplinary actions had dropped by 70%, academic performance had risen across all demographic groups, and student satisfaction surveys showed unprecedented levels of belonging and inclusion. "The Williams family showed us our blind spots," Dr. Chun announced, "but our entire community came together to build something better." Today, Riverside Elementary is being recognized as a model for inclusive education by the State Board of Education. In the audience, Amara wiped away tears as she watched her daughter lead the school in a unity pledge they'd written together. Marcus squeezed her hand, both of them remembering the difficult days that had brought them here. The changes weren't just superficial. Every morning, students were greeted by a diverse team of staff members. The new bus driver, Ms. Rodriguez, knew every child by name and had implemented a buddy system, ensuring no student ever felt isolated. The cafeteria served dishes from various cultures, with students eagerly sharing and learning about different foods. Mrs. Parker, who'd once been their strongest opponent, now led the school's cultural exchange program. Today, she stood beside Amara, co-presenting their successful initiatives to visiting educators from other districts. "It wasn't easy admitting I was part of the problem," Mrs. Parker shared honestly. "But watching these children thrive in an environment of acceptance, it's transformed not just our school, but our entire community." The transformation extended beyond the school walls. The neighborhood had become a tapestry of cultural celebrations, with families sharing traditions and building bridges across old divides. Weekend festivals filled the streets with music, food, and laughter. The community center offered language classes taught by local parents, while the library hosted regular multicultural story times. During lunch, Zara sat at a table that reflected the school's new reality. Emma, her best friend, was learning to braid hair from Zara's mom. David Chin shared his grandmother's dumplings while practicing Spanish with Maria Rodriguez. Children who might never have interacted before now moved freely between groups, curious and accepting. In the teacher's lounge, the conversation had shifted dramatically. Instead of whispered concerns about maintaining standards, staff discussed innovative ways to incorporate diverse perspectives into their lessons. Mrs. Thompson, once hesitant to address racial issues, now led professional development sessions on cultural competency. After school, Zara attended the new STEM club, where students of all backgrounds collaborated on projects. Today, they were designing a solar-powered water filtration system, inspired by similar projects in various countries. The club's diversity had led to creative solutions that might never have emerged from a more homogeneous group. At the monthly community dialogue session, families gathered to share experiences and address ongoing challenges. The atmosphere was different now, open, honest, and solution-focused. Even when difficult topics arose, there was a shared commitment to understanding and growth. Remember when these meetings used to feel like battlegrounds? Sarah Johnson whispered to Amara. Now look at us, actually working together for real change. The Williams family had become respected leaders in the community, but they remained humble about their role. As Marcus often said, we just shone a light on the problem. The entire community chose to face it and fix it together. That evening, at home, Zara worked on her homework, an essay about someone who inspired her. I'm writing about Ruby Bridges, she told her parents, but also about us. About how sometimes you have to go through scary things to make things better for everyone. Amara and Marcus exchanged proud glances. Their daughter had emerged from her ordeal not bitter, but stronger and more compassionate. She'd learned to use her voice not just for herself, but for others who might still be struggling to find theirs. The family's dining room wall now displayed a collection of photographs documenting their journey. Zara's first day at Riverside, the courthouse steps, the formation of the diversity committee, and countless moments of community healing. Among them hung a framed blue ribbon. Not the original one from that rainy day, but a new one given to the family by the school board in recognition of their catalyst role in transforming the district. As they sat down to dinner, a new family who'd just moved to the neighborhood stopped by with a welcome basket, a tradition started by the Community Inclusion Committee. Their children, initially nervous about being the new kids, had already received invitations to join various school activities. When we were researching schools, the mother shared, we chose Riverside specifically because of its commitment to diversity and inclusion. We wanted our children to grow up in a community that celebrates differences. Zara smiled at the new children, remembering her own first days. Don't worry, she told them warmly. Here, everyone belongs. Later that night, as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, the Williams family sat on their porch swing. The sound of children playing filtered through the evening air, a mix of languages, laughter, and joy that represented everything they'd fought for. We did it, didn't we? Zara asked softly, leaning against her mother. We're still doing it, baby, Amara replied, stroking her daughter's hair. Change is a journey, not a destination. Marcus nodded, watching the neighborhood children head home for dinner, walking together regardless of their backgrounds. But look how far we've come, and just imagine how far we'll go. The shadows were still there, but they no longer held power. Instead, they served as reminders of how far they'd come and why they must never stop working toward a brighter, more inclusive future. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest lesson of all, that light always overcomes darkness when people stand together for what's right.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.